queen accused of telling starving peasants to eat cake never actually said it, a phrase that cemented her image as monstrously out of touch. A famous detective's catchphrase, repeated in countless movies and parodies, doesn't actually appear in his original adventures written by his creator. And one of the most celebrated statements championing free speech was actually penned by a biographer, decades after the philosopher it's credited to had passed away, shaping how generations viewed his commitment to the ideal. These are just a few instances where words, wrongly assigned, have powerfully molded our understanding of history and the figures who populate. Number 11. Marie Antoinette, and let them eat cake. The phrase, qu'ils mangent de la brioche, translated as, let them eat cake, is perhaps one of the most infamous lines attributed to a historical figure. It's widely believed to have been uttered by Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, upon being told that her peasant subjects had no bread. This single sentence has been used for centuries to paint her as a callous, decadent aristocrat, utterly oblivious and indifferent to the suffering of the common people, a symbol of the monarchy's detachment that fueled the French Revolution. The image conjured is one of extreme cruelty and a profound lack of empathy, contributing significantly to her villainous portrayal in popular history. However, historical records show no credible evidence that Marie Antoinette ever said these words. The phrase, or very similar ones, had been circulating in Europe for decades before she was even accused of saying it. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his Confessions, written around 1767, when Marie Antoinette was just a child and not yet in France, recounts a story where a great princess was told that the country people had no bread, and she supposedly replied, "Let them eat brioche." Brioche, a rich bread made with eggs and butter, was a luxury item. So the sentiment of indifference remains, but Rousseau does not name the princess. Some historians suggest he might have even invented the anecdote, or was referring to Maria Theresa of Spain, the wife of Louis XIV, who lived a century before Marie Antoinette. The attribution to Marie Antoinette seems to have gained traction in the decades following the French Revolution, particularly in the 1820s. By this point, she had already been executed, and the quote served as convenient post-revolution propaganda to justify the overthrow and execution of the monarchy. It perfectly encapsulated the narrative of an out-of-touch elite feasting, while the masses starved. This misattribution profoundly shaped public perception, transforming Marie Antoinette from a complex historical figure, who by some accounts was charitable and initially popular, into a caricature of aristocratic heartlessness. The phrase became a shorthand for royal disdain, effectively erasing nuances in her character and her role in the events leading to the revolution. It cemented an image of her that persists widely today, largely due to this very potent yet unfounded quotation. The power of these 5 words, wrongly attached to her name, demonstrates how a misattributed quote can become more historically significant than many actual doctrined utterances, fundamentally altering the legacy of a major historical personality. Number 10. Voltaire, and I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. This powerful statement is frequently cited as the ultimate expression of commitment to free speech, and is almost universally attributed to the Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire. It has been invoked by civil libertarians, writers, and activists for generations as a sacrosanct principle, suggesting that Voltaire was such an ardent champion of free expression that he would die to protect even the words he found repugnant. This quote has elevated Voltaire in the popular imagination to an almost mythical status as the fearless, unwavering defender of open discourse, a man whose personal convictions were secondary to the principle of universal freedom of thought. It contributes to a perception of the Enlightenment itself as an era where such pure ideals of tolerance were paramount, championed by figures like Voltaire. Truth is, Voltaire never wrote or said these exact words. The phrase was actually penned by Evelyn Beatrice Hall, an English writer, in her 1906 biography, The Friends of Voltaire. Hall wrote the sentence as a summary of what she believed to be Voltaire's attitude towards free speech, based on his writings and actions, particularly his defense of Claude Adrien Helvetius, whose controversial book De l'Esprit was condemned and burned. Hall wrote, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," was his attitude now. She was attempting to encapsulate his spirit, not quote him directly. When later questioned about the source, Hall confirmed that she had composed the sentence herself. Despite Hall's clarification, the quote quickly became attached to Voltaire himself, often presented as a direct quotation. This misattribution significantly amplified Voltaire's reputation as a free speech absolutist. While Voltaire was indeed a fervent critic of intolerance, censorship, and religious persecution, and he did defend others' rights to publish even those with whom he disagreed, his views were also complex and at times less consistently applied than the quote suggests. He certainly advocated for freedom of the press, but the stark, uncompromising heroism implied by Hall's catchy phrase somewhat simplifies his actual, more nuanced historical stance. The quote's widespread acceptance as Voltaire's own has made him an icon of an idealized version of free speech, potentially obscuring the more intricate realities of his thought and the often messy battles for intellectual freedom during the Enlightenment. It has shaped the perception of Voltaire into a near-perfect embodiment of a principle, rather than a historical figure with human complexities and evolving views. Number 9. Niccolò Machiavelli and "The ends justify the means." This cynical maxim, "the ends justify the means," is almost synonymous with the name Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat and political philosopher of the Renaissance. The bedrock of the term Machiavellian, which describes a person or tactic as cunning, immoral, and ruthlessly pragmatic, willing to do anything, no matter how unethical, to achieve their objectives. The popular perception of Machiavelli, largely fueled by this supposed quote, is that of a cold-hearted advisor to tyrants, advocating for deceit, manipulation, and cruelty as legitimate tools of statecraft. His major work, The Prince, is often read through the lens of this phrase, seen as a handbook for rulers on how to acquire and maintain power by any means necessary, regardless of moral considerations. This has led to his historical image being predominantly negative, portraying him as an architect of a moral political strategy. However, Machiavelli never actually wrote "the ends justify the means" in The Prince or any of his other works. This precise phrasing does not appear, while his writings do explore the idea that rulers might sometimes need to undertake actions that could be considered cruel or unethical for the sake of maintaining the state and ensuring its stability. His arguments are far more nuanced than the bluntness of the attributed quote suggests. For example, in chapter 18 of The Prince, he discusses how a prince should keep his word, but also how circumstances might necessitate breaking it if keeping it would be detrimental to the state. He suggests that a prince should not deviate from what is good if possible, but be able to do evil if constrained. This is a conditional statement, acknowledging a difficult reality rather than a blanket endorsement of wrongdoing. The sentiment that the end justifies the means has ancient roots and has been expressed in various forms by other writers throughout history, including the Roman poet Ovid in his Heroides, who wrote "Exitus acta probat," the outcome justifies the deeds. The specific misattribution to Machiavelli seems to have solidified over time as a convenient, if overly simplistic, summary of his perceived philosophy. This simplification has had a profound impact on how he is viewed. Instead of being seen as a complex thinker grappling with the harsh realities of 16th-century Italian politics and offering pragmatic, if sometimes uncomfortable, advice for a state's survival, he is often reduced to a proponent of unbridled tyranny and amorality. The misattributed quote overshadows his Republican sympathies, expressed in his discourses on Livy, and his genuine concern for stable governance. It has turned Machiavellian into a pejorative term and shaped a lasting, predominantly dark perception of a key figure in political thought. Number 8. Sherlock Holmes and elementary, my dear Watson. The phrase, elementary, my dear Watson, is instantly recognizable as the quintessential Sherlock Holmes line. It conjures the image of the brilliant detective, perhaps with a slight air of condescension or gentle amusement, explaining a seemingly complex deduction to his loyal but less astute companion, Dr. John Watson. This catchphrase has become a cultural touchstone, endlessly repeated in films, television shows, parodies, and common conversation. It firmly establishes Holmes's superior intellect and the dynamic of his relationship with Watson, reinforcing the perception of Holmes as effortlessly brilliant and perhaps a little impatient with those slower to grasp the obvious to him. For many, this phrase is Sherlock Holmes. Surprisingly, the exact phrase, elementary, my dear Watson, never appears in any of the 60 original Sherlock Holmes stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Holmes does say elementary on several occasions. For instance, in The Adventure of the Crooked Man, when Watson expresses admiration for Holmes's deduction, Holmes remarks, elementary. And he does, of course, frequently address Watson as my dear Watson. However, the two parts were never combined by Conan Doyle into that precise, iconic sentence. The closest he came was in The Crooked Man again, where Holmes says, I have the advantage of knowing your habits, my dear Watson. Popularization of elementary, my dear Watson, can be largely traced to later adaptations, particularly stage plays and films. The first documented appearance of a similar phrase was in the 1915 P.G. Wodehouse novel, Smith Journalist, where the character Smith says, elementary, my dear Watson, elementary, in a Holmes-like context. The actor William Gillette, who portrayed Holmes on stage for many years, is sometimes credited with popularizing elements that became Holmesian lore. However, it was likely the early sound films, starting with Basil Rathbone's portrayal of Holmes beginning in 1939, that truly cemented the phrase in the public consciousness. The line appeared in the 1929 film The Return of Sherlock Holmes, starring Clive Brooke, and Rathbone used it or variations of it. This misattributed catchphrase has subtly shaped the perception of Holmes's character, perhaps making him seem a touch more supercilious or formulaic than he is in Conan Doyle's richer, more complex portrayal. While Holmes is undeniably brilliant and confident in the stories, the almost rote repetition of this non-canonical phrase in popular culture has contributed to a slightly simplified, almost caricature-like image of the great detective, emphasizing a catchphrase over the intricate details of his methods and personality as originally written. Number 7. Mahatma Gandhi and be the change you wish to see in the world. This inspirational aphorism is widely attributed to Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of India's independence movement and a global icon of non-violent resistance. It's frequently quoted in Maoism posters, self-help books, social media, and speeches urging individuals to embody the transformations they desire for society. Quote aligns perfectly with Gandhi's philosophy of personal responsibility, self-discipline, and leading by example. It has profoundly shaped the popular understanding of Gandhi's message, portraying him as the originator of this concise, empowering call to personal action as the primary driver of societal improvement. It makes his philosophy seem accessible and directly applicable to everyday life, focusing on individual agency. However, there is no reliable evidence that Mahatma Gandhi ever said or wrote these exact words. While the sentiment is undoubtedly consistent with his teachings and life's work, the precise phrasing, "be the change you wish to see in the world," does not appear in his extensive collected works. Gandhi wrote voluminously, and his speeches and writings are well documented. Researchers and scholars who have meticulously searched his records have not found this specific quote. What Gandhi did express in many different ways was the idea that personal transformation is linked to societal transformation. For example, he wrote, "If we could change ourselves, the tendencies in the world would also change. As a man changes his own nature, so does the attitude of the world change towards him. We need not wait to see what others do." This captures a similar idea, but is more complex and less pithy. Popular quote seems to be a paraphrase or a distillation of his broader philosophy, likely emerging well after his death. It's possible it evolved from attempts to summarize his teachings in a memorable way. One theory suggests it might be a more modern interpretation of his ideas, popularized through secondary sources. The misattribution, while perhaps capturing the essence of his spirit, simplifies a complex body of thought. Gandhi's actual approach to social change involved not just personal example, but also intricate strategies of mass mobilization, political negotiation, and community organizing. By reducing his message to this single, albeit powerful line, the historical perception of Gandhi's methods can become somewhat narrow. It emphasizes the individual almost to the exclusion of the sophisticated, collective, and often challenging political action he orchestrated. While the quote is undeniably inspiring and has motivated many, its attribution to Gandhi contributes to an image of him primarily as a source of easily digestible personal wisdom, potentially overshadowing the full scope and practical complexities of his revolutionary leadership. Number 6. P.T. Barnum, and there's a sucker born every minute. Phineas Taylor Barnum, the 19th century American showman and founder of the Barnum and Bailey Circus, is famously credited with the cynical observation, "There's a sucker born every minute." This phrase has become inextricably linked with Barnum's name and has profoundly shaped his historical image. It paints him as a master manipulator, a shrewd huckster, who knowingly exploited the gullibility of the public for profit. The quote suggests a deep-seated contempt for his audience and implies that his success was built on deliberate deception. This perception of Barnum as the ultimate con artist, gleefully preying on fools, has overshadowed many other aspects of his complex career as an entertainer, businessman, and even a politician and philanthropist. Despite its strong association with him, there's no good evidence that P.T. Barnum ever actually uttered this phrase. Barnum himself denied saying it. In his autobiography and other writings, he often presented himself as someone who provided amusement and wonder, arguing that his patrons received good value for their money, even if some exhibits involved humbug, a term he used for playful deception or exaggeration. He claimed people enjoyed being artfully tricked as long as it was entertaining. Quote is more likely to have originated with one of Barnum's competitors or critics. One common story attributes it to David Henham, a rival showman involved in the Cardiff Giant hoax, who supposedly said it in frustration about the public's continued willingness to be fooled, possibly even in reference to Barnum's attempts to buy the Giant. Another possibility is that it was said by a notorious con man named Joseph, Paper Collar Joe, Bessemer. Regardless of its true origin, the phrase stuck to Barnum. This misattribution has significantly contributed to a one-dimensional view of him. While Barnum was undoubtedly a brilliant marketer and self-promoter who understood public psychology, the sucker quote frames his entire enterprise as fundamentally cynical. It tends to obscure his innovations in advertising, his role in creating mass entertainment, and his later efforts to present his circus as the greatest show on earth, a provider of genuine spectacle and family-friendly amusement. Perception that he viewed his customers merely as fools to be fleeced simplifies his business philosophy, which also included elements of providing affordable entertainment and engaging the public's imagination. The enduring power of this misattributed quote has ensured that for many Barnum is remembered less as a multifaceted entertainment pioneer and more as the embodiment of cynical commercial exploitation. Number 5. Joseph Stalin, and a single death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic. This chillingly detached statement, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic, is widely attributed to Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union. Quote, perfectly encapsulates the image of Stalin as a ruthless, inhumane tyrant, responsible for the deaths of millions of his own citizens through purges, famines, and forced labor. It suggests a profound desensitization to mass suffering and a calculating, almost bureaucratic approach to human life on a grand scale. This quote has been instrumental in solidifying the perception of Stalin as the epitome of cold totalitarian cruelty, a leader for whom individual lives were meaningless in the face of his political objectives. It serves as a horrifying shorthand for the brutal nature of his regime. However, there is no concrete historical evidence that Stalin ever actually said or wrote these precise words. While the sentiment might align with the devastating consequences of his policies and his documented callousness, the origin of the quotation is murky and likely predates or is separate from him. A similar idea can be found in the writings of others, which translates to, "The war. I cannot find it so terrible. The death of one man, that is a catastrophe. 100,000 dead. That is a statistic." This was written before Stalin's Great Purge reached its peak. The sentiment itself reflects a known psychological phenomenon called psychic numbing, where people struggle to comprehend or feel empathy for suffering on a massive scale compared to individual cases. The attribution to Stalin likely gained currency because it so aptly seemed to summarize the unimaginable scale of death under his rule and his perceived indifference to it. It became a powerful piece of rhetoric used to condemn his regime, especially during and after the Cold War. The misattribution is significant because, while Stalin's brutality is well documented and undeniable, this specific quote lends a kind of articulate, almost philosophical malevolence to his persona. It makes him sound like a cold intellectual of evil, rather than just a paranoid and ruthless dictator. It has shaped the perception of his cruelty by giving it a quotable, almost aphoristic expression, making the horror of his reign somehow more cognitively graspable, yet also more chillingly deliberate. It contributes to an image of Stalin not just as a perpetrator of mass death, but as someone who theorized and rationalized it with a terrifying, concise logic. Number 4. Mark Twain, and the only two certainties in life are death and taxes. Mark Twain, the celebrated American humorist and author, Samuel Clemens, is renowned for his witty aphorisms and keen observations on human nature and society. The phrase, "the only two certainties in life are death and taxes," is often attributed to him, fitting perfectly with his characteristic blend of cynical humor and folk wisdom. It's a line that resonates widely, quoted in discussions about the inevitabilities of life, government, and financial burdens. Attributing it to Twain enhances his reputation as a sharp, commonsensical commentator on the American experience, a purveyor of timeless truths wrapped in accessible humor. It cements his image as the wise cracker-barrel philosopher of the people. However, Mark Twain did not originate this saying. While he certainly wrote extensively and humorously about both death and taxes, this particular formulation predates him by a considerable margin. The idea can be traced back to at least the early 18th century. In 1716, the English writer Christopher Bullock included a similar line in his play, The Cobbler of Preston. "'Tis impossible to be sure of anything but death and taxes." Daniel Defoe, in his The Political History of the Devil, 1726, also expressed a comparable thought. "Things as certain as death and taxes can be more firmly believed. Perhaps the most notable early instance, and one that closely resembles the modern phrasing, comes from Benjamin Franklin. In a 1789 letter to Jean-Baptiste Leroy, Franklin wrote, "Our new Constitution is now established and has an appearance that promises permanency. But in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes." The misattribution to Mark Twain likely occurred because the sentiment and style of the quote aligns so well with his known literary persona. Twain was a master of the quotable line, and many sayings, both genuine and apocryphal, have gravitated towards him over time. His established reputation for wit makes him a plausible source for almost any clever remark. Assigning this particular aphorism to Twain has subtly reinforced the popular image of him as an originator of folksy, enduring wisdom. While he was undoubtedly wise and witty, this misattribution contributes to a slight inflation of his specific repertoire of original sayings, making him appear as the source of a piece of wisdom that was already well established in Anglophone culture. It is a common phenomenon where famous wits become magnets for unattributed quotations. And in Twain's case, it further polishes his image as America's quintessential homespun philosopher, even with words that weren't his own. Number 3. Edmund Burke, and the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. This powerful and frequently cited admonition is widely attributed to Edmund Burke, the 18th century Irish statesman, economist, and philosopher, often considered a founder of modern conservatism. Quote, serves as a stirring call to action, urging vigilance and engagement against malevolent forces. It resonates deeply with those who believe in civic responsibility and the moral imperative to oppose injustice. Attributing it to Burke lends it historical weight and intellectual authority, aligning it with his known concerns about societal order, the dangers of radicalism, particularly in response to the French Revolution, and the duties of citizen. It shapes the perception of Burke as a proactive moralist, delivering a timeless warning about the perils of apathy. Despite its widespread association with Burke, there is no evidence that he ever wrote or uttered this precise sentence. Scholars of Burke's extensive writings and speeches have not been able to locate. While the sentiment expressed is broadly consistent with some of Burke's philosophical themes, such as his belief in the importance of established institutions, tradition, and active virtue in maintaining a healthy society, the pithy aphoristic nature of the quote is not entirely characteristic of his more elaborate prose style. Burke did write about the power of evil and the need for good people to be active. For example, in his Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents, 1770, he wrote, "When bad men combine, the good must associate, else they will fall, one by one, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle." This conveys a similar idea, but is more complex and specific to political association. The exact origin of the popular quote is uncertain, but it appears to be a more modern formulation. Some scholars suggest it might be a paraphrase or a later interpretation inspired by various thinkers, possibly gaining currency in the 20th century. John Stuart Mill, for instance, expressed a similar idea in an 1867 address. "Bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and do nothing." This is remarkably close to the version attributed to Burke. The misattribution to Burke likely gained traction because his reputation as a profound political thinker and moralist made him a plausible source for such a weighty statement. This has had an impact on how Burke is popularly understood. Presents him as the author of a very direct and universally applicable maxim about combating evil, which, while not contradicting his general philosophy, simplifies his often complex arguments about prudence, context, and the nature of political action. It makes him an easily quotable champion against passivity, potentially overshadowing the more nuanced and sometimes controversial aspects of his conservative thought. Quote has become a standalone piece of wisdom, carrying Burke's name and authority even without a direct link to his actual words. Number 2. Albert Einstein and insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. This definition of insanity is one of the most frequently quoted sayings attributed to Albert Einstein, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, renowned for his theories of relativity. Quote is widely used in contexts ranging from self-help and business management to everyday advice, often cited to encourage innovation, learning from mistakes, or changing unproductive behaviors. Attributing it to Einstein lends it an air of profound intellectual authority and scientific insight, as if this observation on human behavior carries the same weight as his groundbreaking work in physics, contributes to the popular image of Einstein, not just as a scientific genius, but also as a fount of general wisdom and sagacity on the human condition. However, there is no evidence that Albert Einstein ever said or wrote these words. Despite extensive documentation of his writings, speeches, and letters, this particular aphorism does not appear among them. The origins of the quote are actually quite diffuse and difficult to pin down precisely. Variations of the saying can be found in American self-help and recovery literature, particularly associated with neurotics, Anonymous and Alcoholics, anonymous publications dating back to the early 1980s. For instance, a 1981 Narcotics Anonymous pamphlet reportedly contained the line, "Insanity is repeating the same mistakes and expecting different results." Similar sentiments can be found even earlier in other contexts, but the specific phrasing and its connection to insanity seem to have gained prominence through these recovery programs. The misattribution to Einstein likely occurred because of his iconic status as a genius. Famous intelligent people often become magnets for unattributed quotes that sound wise or encyclical. Einstein, with his distinct appearance and universally recognized intellect, became a particularly popular figure for such attributions. Pinning the insanity quote on him elevates its perceived importance and makes it more memorable. This misattribution has subtly altered the popular perception of Einstein. While he was undoubtedly a brilliant thinker who did comment on broader societal and philosophical issues, this specific quote paints him as a direct commentator on psychological patterns in a way that isn't supported by his actual work. It reinforces the idea of Einstein as an all-purpose oracle whose genius extended effortlessly into diagnosing common human foibles with pithy definitions. This popular yet incorrect association overshadows the true, often more nuanced sources of such common-sense wisdom, while slightly mythologizing Einstein beyond his already extraordinary scientific achievements into a universal sage. Number 1. Winston Churchill and various witty political aphorisms, such as, "If you're not a liberal when you're 25, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative by the time you're 35, you have no brain." Winston Churchill, the British statesman who led his country through the Second World War, is celebrated for his powerful oratory and sharp wit. A vast number of memorable quotes are attributed to him, covering topics from war and politics to personal philosophy. One such widely circulated saying is, "If you're not a liberal when you're 25, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative by the time you're 35, you have no brain," with variations in ages and exact wording. This aphorism is often used to describe a common political evolution, suggesting youthful idealism naturally gives way to mature pragmatism. Attributing it to Churchill lends it an air of experienced wisdom and bipartisan insight, fitting his complex political journey, which saw him switch parties. It reinforces his image as a master of the political quip, capable of summing up life's truths with cynical elegance. However, there is no solid evidence that Churchill ever said or wrote this particular aphorism, or many others commonly ascribed to him without firm sourcing. This specific saying about liberalism and conservatism has a long and tangled history, with similar sentiments being attributed to various figures long before or during Churchill's time. Weigh-ins of the idea can be traced back to 19th century France. Anselm Polycarpe Batby, a French academic and politician, is reported to have said in the 1870s, "He who is not a Republican at 20 compels one to doubt the generosity of his heart, but he who after 30 persists compels one to doubt the soundness of his mind." Similar statements have also been linked to French figures like King Oscar II of Sweden and Norway, referring to being a socialist, and even the French statesman Georges Clemenceau. Core idea seems to have been a floating piece of political commentary for many decades. The misattribution to Churchill is likely due to his well-deserved reputation as a highly quotable and witty speaker. His genuine speeches and writings are filled with memorable phrases, making him a plausible source for almost any clever or encyclical remark, especially on political matters. Over time, many unattributed witticisms have become attached to his name. This phenomenon has subtly shaped the perception of Churchill. While he was undeniably a master wordsmith and a complex political thinker, the accumulation of apocryphal quotes can sometimes create an image of him as an almost superhuman font of endless, perfectly formed aphorisms, perhaps even overshadowing substance. In the case of the liberal conservative quote, it makes him appear to be the originator of a specific, widely recognized observation on political maturation, when in fact, he was at most a potential repeater or adapter of an older idea. This contributes to a legendary, almost folkloric status, where the man becomes synonymous with political wit itself, sometimes at the expense of precise historical accuracy regarding his own utterances.